Before I get started, I wanted to mention Arthur Manuel left us two books. One's called Unsettling Canada. If you haven't read that, I encourage you to get that book. And the other book Arthur wrote, which was published after he passed, is called The Reconciliation Manifesto. And if you haven't read those books, they're very important books to get you started in talking about the real history of colonialism in Canada and our way out of it. Art's book, The Reconciliation Manifesto, was written to kind of lay out the vision that he saw for really addressing colonization and decolonization. So before I got started, I wanted to mention those two books as a way to start learning about these issues. So what I wanted to talk about, 2019 is the 50th anniversary of the 1969 White Paper on Indian Policy. And I want to go through and talk about that because I also want to talk about Justin Trudeau's plan to entrench a fourth level of Indigenous government in Canada, because it's connected to what was proposed in the 1969 White Paper. So I want to talk a bit about the historical context of colonization, the key Liberal platform promises of 2015, what they've done since then, and then I want to talk about the recognition and implementation of rights framework. Now, because I come from the East, I would say that the first Europeans that the Haudenosaunee or Iroquoian people came in contact with were the Dutch coming up the Hudson River. And one of the oldest treaties in North America is the Two-Row Waffle. And that was the agreement we made with the Dutch. And the Dutch got pushed out by the British, and that's the agreement we made with the British. Now, I think we all know that things changed in the Americas when European contact happened. And in the East, the gentleman at the bottom, we've got Jacques Cartier, who sailed up to St. Lawrence first, followed by Samuel de Champlain, and then on what they call Newfoundland, in Bonavista, John Cabot landed for England. And well, they debate on whether he landed Bonavista or not. But anyways, that started the change in the Americas for us as Indigenous nations. For one thing, Canada bases its territorial and assertion of sovereignty over Indigenous nations by relying on the racist and outdated notions of terra nullius, or vacant land, and the doctrine of discovery. And the terra nullius part really applies into what's now Quebec, because when they came, they viewed Indigenous peoples as being non-Christians and infidels, and therefore not humans. And so they began to assert their jurisdiction in what is now Quebec. Now these are some examples of wampum boats. Wampum boats are made out of quahog shells, clam shells. They come in purple and white. You know, we make little cylinder beads from them. And it traditionally took a long time to do it because often they would break when they were being made. So it's very valuable to have wampum beads. And those beads were used to be strung in different symbols to commemorate agreements. And those agreements were made between Indigenous nations before Europeans came, before contact. The Algonquin-speaking peoples and the Iroquois-speaking peoples, often we would get into conflicts, and we would have to make treaties between ourselves. And we did that through wampum, exchanging wampum belts, which were then handed down from generation to generation to remind us of the agreements that were made. And when the Europeans came, they were incorporated into that tradition, and that's why with the Two-Row Wampum, for example, and other wampum belts were exchanged to commemorate agreements with French-speaking and English-speaking peoples. So that was, and the point about this was, you couldn't enter the territory without consent. You couldn't do anything without consent. And the reason why agreements were entered into us was to become military and trade partners. And, you know, at that time we outnumbered the Europeans. So it was important for them to have agreements with us, or consent, before entering our territories. Which, like I said, where I come from in the east, that's the way it was. And right up to the War of 1812, when the Americans tried to invade Canada, it was the Mohawks, the Ojibwe warriors, the Diabo warriors, the Delaware warriors. We were on the front lines, and we fought those Americans back. Otherwise, Trump would be your president right now. And that was pretty much the last time the treaties we had made, pre-Confederation, early treaties we made, were respected in the East. Because after the War of 1812, in the East, we started to get outnumbered by settlers who were loyalists who were coming up from the United States and Canada. But the Crown did, the British Crown did continue to make treaties across the country before Canada was formed. You can see here a map of the treaties that started in the East and went across the prairies. The only one of the number of treaties that touches British Columbia is Treaty Number 8, covers the northeastern part of British Columbia. The only other treaties in BC are the Douglas Treaties on Vancouver Island. Other than that, all of BC is Aboriginal title territory. Those treaties in the Atlantic are peace and friendship treaties. There are some peace and friendship treaties that are missing in the Quebec part of this map. But you get an idea of the historic or original treaties that were made across the country. Now in 1867, what I call the Fathers of Colonization got together in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, to start talking about developing a new constitution. They were negotiating that. Indigenous nations were excluded from those negotiations, despite the treaties that were made. And that's where they came up with the first Constitution of Canada to divide powers between the national government, the federal government, and provincial governments. And federal powers were under Section 92 of that Constitution. Section 91. Provincial powers are under Section 92. That Constitution was adopted by England, the British North America Act. That was Canada's first Constitution, because Canada was a colony of Britain. But for what they call Indians at the time, they became a subject matter under the Constitution. Section 91.24 said the federal parliament will have exclusive legislative authority over Indians and lands reserved for Indians. And that's the constitutional power they used to pass the Indian Act in 1876, which is still in place today. The Indian Act defines who an Indian is, what a band is, what a reserve is, what a band council is, what the powers of a band council are. Under the Indian Act, it defines pretty much every aspect of living on reserve, including the residential schools, included in the Indian Act. And in 1885, well, right after Confederation, Sir John A. Macdonald, the first Prime Minister, imposed a pass system. And the RCMP knew that it wasn't legal, but he told them to enforce it anyway. And there's a good movie by a friend of mine named Alex Williams about this called The Pass System. You should get it and show it here. Because they had survivors of the pass system talking in that documentary about how the pass system worked. The Indian agent on the reserve would hand it out, and on there would be the purpose in which you were being allowed off the reserve, for how long, and if you were caught without this, you could be arrested and put in jail by the RCMP. And they really applied the pass system in Saskatchewan and Alberta. And in fact, this copy here that's shown here is one of the original passes that Alex Williams found in a museum in Alberta, because the federal government had told all the Indian agents to forward all the passes to Ottawa so they could destroy them. but some of them were still left in this museum in Alberta, and that's what he found. And then he found some of the survivors that remembered the past system being applied to their communities, their reserves. And it lasted right up to the 1940s. And the reason why they wanted the past system was for a couple reasons. One was Sir John A. Macdonald was forcing the railroad through the prairies at the time. And the other reason was they wanted to open up the prairies to European settlement for farming. And so they wanted to have Indians controlled right across, well, like say Saskatchewan, Alberta in particular. And they also used, there's a book called Clearing the Plains. That's a good book to read because it also shows that Sir John A. Macdonald used the policy of starvation as another method of control during that time period. Now these two guys, as we are here today, these two people here were still living with their legacy. In 1968, basically about 100 years after Confederation, first Constitution, Pierre Elliott Trudeau was elected in as Prime Minister, and he named Jean Chrétien as his Minister of Indian Affairs. And Jean Chrétien, of course, would later on become the Minister of Justice and then Prime Minister. So these two have had an enduring legacy over the past number of decades, past 5 decades, on Indigenous nations. In 1969, they proposed a white paper on Indian policy. Now, normally a white paper is a discussion paper in Ottawa, that's what they call white papers. But in this instance, they made it as a statement on Indian policy. And in there, they proposed to eliminate Indian status by dissolving the Department of Indian Affairs within 5 years, to abolish the Indian Act and remove Section 9124 from Canada's first Constitution, and to convert reserve land into private property that could be sold by the band or its members, and to transfer responsibility for Indian affairs from the federal government to the provinces, and basically have those services delivered on reserve the same as Canadian citizens get theirs from the provinces. And to address the poverty that was there, they were proposing funding for a transition period for economic development. But they also wanted to appoint a commissioner to address outstanding land claims and gradually eliminate the historic or original treaties, which I showed you a map of earlier. So out here in BC, in response to the white paper, the chiefs across BC created the Union of BC Indian Chiefs in 1969 up in Kamloops. And this is a picture of that gathering when they all came together. At that time, there was only one political advocacy organization in Canada. In BC, now you have two, the First Nations Summit and the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. And so First Nations organized opposition to the white paper by forming regional associations and a national one across Canada. The National Need Brotherhood is the precursor to the Assembly of First Nations, but it was the umbrella organization for all the regional organizations. Position papers in response to the white paper were developed and presented to the federal government, including in 1971, the Indians of Alberta Association, which included Harold Cardinal, a young leader, Cree leader. They handed Pierre Trudeau the red paper. And that caused the Trudeau government to publicly say, okay, we're going to withdraw the policy. But internally, they decided rather than trying to push this white paper package in 5 years, they decided to extend the time frame, and instead of talking about it as a package, to work on it as components or pieces. And also, what happened after the white paper was in 1971, out here in BC again, Frank Calder, a Nisga'a leader, went to court to argue that the Nisga'a had Aboriginal title. And it went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada when they handed down a decision in 1971. 3 judges said, yes, the Nisga'a have Aboriginal title. 3 judges said if they had Aboriginal title, it ceased to exist when BC joined Confederation. And the 7th judge said you didn't give notice to the Lieutenant Governor before you took them to court. So he ruled against them on a technicality. But On the main issue of whether self-government existed, the court was split 3-3. And that freaked out Pierre Trudeau because he had to back up. He said, maybe you have more rights than I thought you had. And that's when in 1973 he announced the land claims policies that Justin Trudeau is still implementing today. He said there's going to be two types of claims that they're going to negotiate. Comprehensive claims would be for claims where historic treaties, land treaties weren't entered into, where there was an Aboriginal title that they hadn't addressed. And that would have been British Columbia, the Yukon, the Northwest Territories, Quebec, the 5 Atlantic provinces, parts of Ontario, and some other parts of Canada. They said they would negotiate comprehensive claims in those areas. Specific claims, those kind of claims are basically in the historic treaties. If a reserve was promised and not given, then that's called treaty land entitlement. That's an example of a specific claim. Or if a reserve land was, let's say, illegally, part of it was sold off by an Indian agent, the band would be entitled to compensation for the loss of use of that land. So that would be a specific claim. Or another example would be if the timber was cut on a reserve and the money from the sale of the timber was put into a trust fund in Ottawa to hold on behalf of the band, and they mismanaged that money, then that would be a specific claim. So those are the two types of land claims that Canada said they negotiate, and those policies are still in place today. Also, in response to the white paper and the opposition to the white paper, the federal government proposed Indian Act amendments throughout the 1970s. And also in 1975, the first, what they call modern treaty was signed with the James Bay Northern Quebec Agreement under that 1973 policy. That's where they were building a huge hydroelectric dam. And also there was a joint National New Brotherhood Cabinet Committee formed. George Manuel, Arthur Manuel's father, was the president of National New Brotherhood at the time. He pulled out of that because he didn't want to be rubber stamped, because Trudeau was trying to use that committee to support policies that he was unilaterally trying to push through. And you'll see later we're kind of back to that again today in deja vu. There was a Native Peoples Caravan that marched on Ottawa to protest treaty and Aboriginal rights violations. I believe that was 1974. Anishinaabe Park in Ontario was occupied in Kenora to protest racism. So there was a lot of reaction to the white paper that was happening throughout the 70s of the idea of proposing not recognizing rights. In 1980, Trudeau met in Ottawa with chiefs at a National Union Brotherhood meeting. It was announced his plans to amend the Constitution and called on their support. And I was there at that meeting. I remember Trudeau coming there and telling the chiefs that he asked the chiefs to treat Canada better than Canada treated them. And he announced he wanted to bring the Constitution back from England, because Canada's first Constitution was enacted in the British Parliament, the British North America Act. Also at that time, Jean Chrétien was appointed as Federal Justice Minister, because he was Indian Affairs Minister before that. And he's put in charge of the constitutional patriation process. So he's put in charge of the negotiations with the premiers and territorial leaders. And Ron Irwin is named as his parliamentary secretary. And I mention this because Ron Irwin went on to become Minister of Indian Affairs. And there's a connection to all of these guys, so that's why I'm mentioning who's who. They continue to have a role affecting our rights. And constitutional issues became the priority for National Union Brotherhood because of the concern about impacts on treaty and Aboriginal rights. I know Sharon's going to correct me with some of this stuff. 1980-81, Indian, Inuit, and Métis representatives began meeting with the federal and provincial representatives to discuss wording for recognition of Aboriginal treaty rights in the new Constitution. And in 1981, a clause respecting Aboriginal rights was first inserted and then removed at the insistence of two Western premiers, which were Saskatchewan and Alberta. Blakeney and Logie had asked for that to be removed. Aboriginal peoples responded by mobilizing and literally camping in Ottawa to protest and lobby federal politicians. Again, out here in British Columbia, George Manuel, Bobby Manuel, and a number of other leaders organized what was called the Constitutional Express. And it was a train to leave from Vancouver to go across the country to Ottawa. And the train actually split in two. One went north and one went south. They joined up again, I believe, in Thunder Bay before they went into Ottawa. And thousands of Indian people showed up in Ottawa to protest at Parliament Hill and at the Governor General's. And some of them actually went off to Europe to lobby in Europe to pressure Canada to put the clause back in that they took out. So in the fall, some Aboriginal representatives reached an agreement with the premiers and the Prime Minister on wording, excuse me, on an Aboriginal clause, and that became Section 35 of the new Constitution. And Section 35 just says, well, the one that they removed said the Aboriginal treaty rights of Aboriginal peoples are recognized and affirmed. But when they put it back in, they added the word existing, so that it said the existing Aboriginal treaty rights of Aboriginal peoples are hereby recognized and affirmed. And they added that word in there to try and limit future interpretations of that clause. And another clause they added was Section 37, which provided that there had to be a First Ministers' Conference on Aboriginal matters within 1 year of the new Constitution becoming law. And at that time, several First Nations joined forces to go to England and launch a court action and lobby British MPs to vote against the Canada Bill until their legal and constitutional concerns were addressed. But there was a court decision there by Lord Denny that was handed down, and he said Canada could patriate their constitution, but he said they have to respect the treaty promises as long as the sun shines and the grass grows. But the Constitution was patriated and brought back to Canada. And the Queen signed it into law on Parliament Hill. And that happened on April 17th, 1982, 37 years ago. And at that same time, after that Constitution became law, the Trudeau government, Pierre Trudeau's government, created a special parliamentary committee on Indian self-government to review legal and constitutional issues regarding status, development, and responsibilities of band governments on reserves. It became known as the Penner Committee after Keith Penner. He was the chair of the committee. It was a Liberal dominated committee, but they also included all parties on it. And they included the 4 national Aboriginal representatives as ex officio members. And that report, the Penner Report, as it was called on Indian self-government, recommended the federal government recognize First Nations as a distinct order of government within the Canadian Federation and pursue processes leading to self-government. The report also proposed a constitutional entrenchment of self-government and, in the short term, introduction of legislation to facilitate it. And I remember the Trudeau government had Bill C-52, an act to recognize self-government, but it died when they called a federal election. So, from 1983 to 1987, there were 4 First Ministers' Conferences. That Section 37 process in 1983, they amended the Constitution to say we're going to have 3 more constitutional conferences. So that meant there were 4 altogether. And the main issue of those negotiations is whether Aboriginal self-government was an inherent right already recognized in Section 35 of the Constitution, or it was a delegated authority subject to reaching agreements with the federal, territorial, and provincial governments. In 1985, there was, in the federal election that was held, the Conservatives formed a majority government. So Brian Mulroney became the Prime Minister, and he became the chair of this constitutional talks. At that time, they also proposed amendments to the Indian Act, which was intended to eliminate gender discrimination against status Indian women. Many criticized the bill as insufficient. There has been several court cases after, again, amending the registration and membership sections of the Indian Act even today. There was also an internal federal report leaked to the media by a DIA employee. The report was nicknamed the Buffalo Jump of the 1980s by another federal official. That federal official was a deputy minister of Indian Affairs named Russ from Alberta. And they were using that term Buffalo Jump of the 1980s to be like a metaphor for herding Indians over their cultural death over a cliff. And the Buffalo Jump report proposed a management approach to First Nations policy and programs by limiting and eventually terminating the federal trust obligations, or as the courts would say now, fiduciary obligations. Reducing federal expenditures or spending for First Nations underfunding programs and prohibiting bans to operate by deficit financing. There were other measures too, but those are the main purposes of that report. In 1987, the final First Ministers' Conference on Aboriginal Matters was held. In 1987, what the Aboriginal leaders didn't know at the time is that Moroni had started secret negotiations with the Quebec Premier, Robert Bourassa, to recognize Quebec as a distinct society in the Constitution. So basically that was a sidelining of the Aboriginal issues, which were supposed to be the first matter dealt with when the Constitution was brought back from England. But they pushed that aside and went to move on to Quebec's demands. And under the existing Constitution, the amending formula is 7 provinces with 50% of the population. Trudeau put that in there because of the 7 provinces. That means you either have to have Quebec or Ontario involved, or you can't amend the Constitution. Because the 50% of the population, most of them live in central Canada. So without central Canada, the Constitution can't be amended. But with the Meech Lake Accord, what Moroni did was he made an even higher threshold. He said the constitutional amendment for a distinct society had to have unanimous consent by 10 provinces. So that was an even higher threshold than 7 provinces. And it also put it in there that it had to be done by the end of June 1990. All 10 provinces had to approve that constitutional amendment for the Distinct Society Clause. The Liberals elected Jean Chrétien as leader in Calgary, Alberta. And the Liberal Convention also created the Aboriginal Peoples Commission of the Liberal Party of Canada. And that commission still exists as the Indigenous Peoples Commission. That's the commission that would have been recruiting people like Jody Wilson-Raybould to run for a Liberal member of Parliament. At the same time that meeting was going on in Calgary, Elijah Harper was refusing to give unanimous consent in the Manitoba legislature to the Meech Lake Accord. He ran out to talk on it, and it died. And that's because the Manitoba legislature had certain rules around constitutional provisions that you had to have unanimous consent. And he said no and refused to give that consent. And that ended the Meech Lake Accord. Now, the failure of that Meech Lake Accord led to anger amongst many Quebec politicians and citizens. It's my view, I can't prove it, but it's my view that that's what led to the July 11th, 1990 raid by a SWAT team on a Mohawk blockade set up to stop an expansion of a golf course on the Mohawk lands, which included a burial site in Kanienkehaka near the town of Oka. And it led to protracted conflict, which involved the Canadian Army being called in. And my community, Kahnawake, in support of Kanienkehaka, blocked the Nehiyaw Bridge. And at one point, the Army landed on an island in our community. And the people, men and women, came out and fought hand-to-hand with the Army, and they had to retreat back into their helicopter and fly away. And you notice they have guns, and the people didn't. They didn't care, they just went after them and beat them back. So that attack would leave, one policeman dead, and lead to a 78-day standoff between the Mohawks and police, like I said, the Army. And when Parliament resumed in September 1990, Brian Moroni began the Parliament session by announcing his 4 pillars of Native policy. He said he would accelerate the settlement of land claims. That led to the creation of an Indian Claims Commission for specific claims. That led to the BC Treaty Commission process. He also said that they were to improve economic and social conditions on reserves, strengthen the relationships between Aboriginal peoples and governments, and examine the concerns of Aboriginal peoples in contemporary Canadian life. And that one led to the creation of a Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, these 4 pillars. And in 1992, Moroni tried once more to amend Canada's Constitution. Aboriginal organizations and the federal government agreed, as part of that proposed amendment to the Constitution, that the recognition of the inherent right to self-government would be included in the Constitution. Aboriginal organizations were full participants in those talks. They were also including the Distinct Society Clause and an elected Senate, so it was a package of constitutional amendments, but it was rejected in a national referendum across Canada. So that ended constitutional reform in Canada, at least so far. In 1993, the federal election saw the Liberals, headed up by Jean Chrétien, form a majority government. The Liberals had electoral promises on Aboriginal issues, which are included in 2 documents, Chapter 7 of the 1993 Red Book, and a longer Aboriginal platform released by Chrétien in Saskatchewan during the campaign. A big promise that they made at their time is that the Liberal government would act on the premise that the inherent right to self-government is an existing Aboriginal treaty right within the meaning of Section 35. But in 1995, Chrétien broke that promise to recognize the inherent right to self-government by adopting an Aboriginal self-government policy which recognizes the right in an abstract sense, but doesn't recognize that any particular First Nation has the right on the ground. And that policy also has preconditions to negotiations that convert Indian Act bans into municipal-type governments. And there were monies attached, negotiation dollars attached to the policy. So you have hundreds of bands who are negotiating under this policy today as we're here. And in 1996, in the fall, that Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples report was released. It had 5 volumes, 440 recommendations. The Chrétien government, he was the Prime Minister then, he dismissed that report as being too costly and asserted that the Liberal policies already had in place, you know, like on land claims and self-government and programs and services, were already addressing much of what was in the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples report. So they put it on the shelf. So Chrétien, after that, he tried to propose an Indian Act Amendment package in 1996. I wound up becoming the Indian Act Amendments Coordinator for the Assembly First Nations when Owen McCurdy was National Chief. We analyzed that package and saw it was worse than the status quo, and we recommended to the chiefs that it be rejected. They agreed with us, and we campaigned against that bill, and in the end, they called it the Indian Act Optional Modification Act. They tried to say it would be optional. But it died when they called an election in 1997. And Chrétien again tried to bring it back. The bureaucracy and him tried to bring it back in 2000 when he named Robert Nault as Minister of Indian Affairs. And they called it the First Nations Governance Act. That was also defeated. That was basically Chrétien's legacy legislation he was trying to push before he retired from politics. And in 2004, he retired and Paul Martin took over. And Paul Martin basically just did roundtables. He didn't do much on Aboriginal issues. There was the so-called Colonial Accord, but he knew his government was going to fall when he offered to spend $10 billion over 10 years, I think, in programs. And sure enough, his government did fall. And in early 2006, Stephen Harper, the Conservatives, formed the government. And in what we call the dark decade, the Harper government's policies were to remove Aboriginal peoples as a federal priority. They ignored the 2005 Colonial Accord, as it was called. The media called it the Colonial Accord. It was basically just a press release, because I was at the Colonial when that came out. It's kind of a myth that's been created that it was actually like a political accord. The provinces didn't sign on to anything. The Harper government focused on individual rights to undermine collective rights. They also capped or offloaded spending on First Nations programs during those 10 years. Like the Liberals, they were using existing federal policies of land claims and self-government to limit or empty out Section 35 of any significant meaning. And they maintained the Indian Act, opposed amendments like the Matrimonial Property Act, other First Nations legislation they introduced. And then in 2007, the United Nations adopted the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. 211 states, I believe, voted for it. 11, I think, abstained, and 4 voted against it. And that was Canada, the United States, New Zealand, and Australia who voted against it. And of course, those are all the former colonies of England, have Indigenous peoples within their borders. And for the most part, have roots in British Commonwealth, although the United States separated itself from that revolution. So there's 46 articles in the UN Declaration. I only cite a few here. The most important one, I think, is Article 3, the right to self-determination. That Indigenous peoples have that right. That just, in my view, just affirms that the UN covenants on civil and political rights and socioeconomic and cultural rights apply to Indigenous peoples, including the right of self-determination as peoples. Article 10, no forced removal without prior informed consent. Well, you know, that wasn't the case when we saw them removing that blockade in the Wet'suwet'en territory. Article 19, free prior informed consent is required before legislation and administrative measures. This government's bypassing the rights holders, the community people, and just dealing from the top down through the national indigenous organizations. So they're not respecting that article. Now, Justin Trudeau never talks about these articles. Article 26 says there should be restoration of traditional lands, territories, and resources to Indigenous peoples. Article 27 says there should be a fair process jointly developed to adjudicate rights to lands, territories, and resources. And Indigenous peoples have never had a say, First Nations have never had a say in that 1973 land claims policy. There's been some consultations on processes, but not the policies. Those are always unilateral declarations by the Canadian state. So there hasn't been a fair process to adjudicate land rights in Canada. And Article 28 says there should be restitution where lands, territories, and resources are not restored. And under these so-called land claims policies, there isn't compensation. Article 32 says free prior informed consent is required for development affecting lands, territories, and resources. That's not being followed in Canada. Article 37, rights from treaties. Now, agreements and constructible arrangements is something they added on. My understanding is that it was supposed to originally be just about treaties, but that's in the UN Declaration. Now, because those Section 35 was supposed to be a political agreement in those constitutional talks in the 1980s, and those talks ended in failure, the courts took over starting in 1990 to interpret Section 35. And the Supreme Court, the first decision interpreting it was the Sparrow case. Again, out here in BC, the Musqueam Band was charged with using a net larger than what the Department of Fisheries and Ocean regulations allowed. And they said they had an Aboriginal right under Section 35 to use a bigger net. And that case went all the way to the Supreme Court. It was the first case dealing with Section 35. And the court said Aboriginal treaty rights are not absolute. They can be justifiably infringed for a valid legislative objective. And the court also laid out, hierarchy, saying conservation is at the top, then Aboriginal use, and then public use, because they were talking about the fisheries. And that became the basis of Canada's Aboriginal fishing strategy out here, where they try to say they're managing the fish stocks. Of course, there's lots of arguments about their science and that they're mismanaging. And issuing the Aboriginal food fishery permits, and then deciding how much fish are available for commercial and sports fishing. That all came out of the Sparrow decision. But over the past 30 plus years, the Supreme Court of Canada has been handing down court cases legal tests, which now amount to an Aboriginal legal framework. And to meet the legal tests and principles they laid out, because the burden of proof is still on Indigenous groups to prove their rights if they say they have them. It costs millions and millions of dollars to collect the historical and cultural evidence to meet the legal tests. And even then, it's a crapshoot, because depending on who's sitting on the bench, they can even overturn previous decisions that they've made or reinterpret. And so in terms of getting justice through the judicial system, it's a pretty high threshold to meet. Now in 2015, the Trudeau government had a number of promises that came in on. It said that they'd immediately re-engage in a renewed nation-to-nation process with Indigenous peoples. They prioritized developing in full partnership with First Nations a federal reconciliation framework. And the framework would include mechanisms to advance and strengthen self-government, address outstanding land claims, resolve grievances with both existing historical treaties and modern land claims agreements. They'd enact the 94 calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and they'd adopt the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. They also said they'd recognize and respect Aboriginal entitlement rights, but in accordance with Canada's constitutional obligations, and further those enshrined in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So as we'll see, although they're saying they're recognizing and respecting on the one hand, on the other hand, they're introducing provisos or limitations to deny or limit and restrict the interpretation of those. They also promised to immediately lift the 2% cap on funding for First Nations programs and establish a new fiscal relationship with First Nations. Well, that 2% cap on First Nations programs was put into place when Jacques Chrétien was Prime Minister. Paul Martin was the Finance Minister. So he put that 2% cap on, and he didn't take it off when he was Prime Minister. For 1 quarter or not, he didn't remove that cap. So you should know that. And that cap didn't take into account the rate of inflation or population growth. So budgets of First Nations have been watered down consistently since then, since 1995 when they put it in. So this is a big promise. The Trudeau government promised to undertake a full review of regulatory law, policies, and operational practices in full partnership and consultation with First Nations to ensure that the Crown is fully executing its consultation, accommodation, and consent obligations, including on resource development and energy infrastructure project reviews and assessments, something BC should be aware of, right? If you hear about these things. And again, here it is, in accordance with our constitutional and international human rights obligations, which the federal government gets to interpret. You know, the constitutional and international obligations. So what has the Trudeau government done? Well, when Trudeau first got in 2016, at a public event organized by The Economist magazine, he was asked how he was going to liberalize and deregulate interprovincial trade within Canada. And Trudeau said the way to get that done is not to sit here and impose. The way to have that done is to actually have a good working relationship with the premiers, the municipal governments, and Indigenous leadership, because Indigenous governments are the fourth level of government in this country. So that's important to note. That's how he sees Indigenous governments in the Federation. So in December 15th in 2016, Trudeau announced basically a two-track reconciliation approach. The people standing behind him are the three national Indigenous leaders for the First Nations, Métis and Inuit, the national organizations. He's using this top-down approach to use these national Indigenous organizations to bypass the rights holders in the communities, because he's doing this top-down secretive approach. And basically his two-track plan, one focus is on short-term issues, the other on longer-term relationships. The short-term issues are basically the first Constitution of Canada, Section 9124, remember, says the federal government has exclusive legislative authority over Indians and lands reserved for Indians. So that means the Indian Act and non-reserve programs. So that's one focus, one track. The other track is Section 35, and that's the existing Aboriginal treaty rights of Aboriginal peoples. So under this two-track approach, they split the Department of Indian and Northern Affairs Canada into two to create the Indigenous Crown Relations Department and the Indigenous Services Department. Jane Philpott is gone. I put this slide there when she was still there. It's Seamus O'Regan now, but it's the same idea. There's two ministers. Bennett is the Crown Relations Minister. Philpott was Indigenous Services, which is now Seamus O'Regan. But under the two-track plan, Indigenous Services is basically focused on maintaining and amending the Indian Act indefinitely, to look at the legislation over First Nations under fiscal institutions, First Nations Land Management Act, Recognition Act. They have an additions to reserve policy, where if they agree, you can expand the reserve, but that's mostly based on legal obligations to do so. They have on-reserve programs and services that the Minister of Indigenous Services focuses on. Infrastructure, housing, education, and so on. And also the First Nations and Inuit Health Branch was merged under the Department of Indigenous Services Canada. And then for Carolyn Bennett, the Minister of Crown Relations, her job is to look after the unilateral Aboriginal treaty rights interpretation, including the federal consultation policy, the federal self-government policy to municipalize bans, the comprehensive and specific land claims policies, which are really based on denial and extinguishment, and to look at the Supreme Court decisions or legal tests, coming up with alternatives to go into court, mediation. And she would be doing that in concert with the Justice Minister, which was Jody Wilson-Raybould for a while. And also to look after the work the federal government's doing on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action and the UN Declaration articles. They've set up a National Reconciliation Table, which was recommended by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Also, the federal government's adopted 10 federal principles on Indigenous relationships. I'll get into those. Carolyn Bennett is basically been charged with applying those to policy and law. They have actually 75 rights and recognition tables, which are holding secret talks across the country. They made an agreement. The first agreement they made with the 70 First Nations was on a fiscal relations table. You can see Carolyn Bennett and Pierre signing that agreement. That set up a fiscal relations process. And out of that process, they produced a report in December 2017 that said, aside from the federal transfer payments going to bands, if the bands want more money, they can increase economic development by growing First Nations businesses, which of course would be in accordance with federal and provincial laws. And basically they're talking about mom and pop shops, nothing more than that. And then they're talking about resolving comprehensive and specific claims and additions of reserves, a way of raising more money. But I'll explain to you why that's not really an option. And creating and increasing resource revenue sharing without involved agreements with the provinces. The only province that's even talking about revenue sharing with First Nations is British Columbia. The other provinces, mostly headed by conservative premiers, are running the other way. They don't want to talk to the federal government or First Nations about revenue sharing. There's also other forums such as gaming, and I understand the government of British Columbia just announced last week they're going to share gaming revenues with First Nations. So I think that only leaves Quebec and New Brunswick as the only provinces that don't share revenues with First Nations. Every other province has some kind of an agreement to share that. And then the last one, of course, is taxation. And that's the one the governments really want to get at, because Section 87 of the Indian Act says property on reserve is non-taxable. And the courts have ruled that income earned on reserve is non-taxable. And they've extended that to connected factors. So in many cases, there could be people doing work which benefit the reserves of bands, and they won't be paying income tax either. And they want to the federal government has long wanted to get rid of Section 87 in the Indian Act. And they do that through agreements that are signed. That's part of the deal, but you have to give that up. The other agreement that Canada signed with AFN was one on joint priorities. or shared priorities. And they had 8 points. I just focused on these ones. These are the main ones I think are important. They signed this in June 2017. So the Assembly of First Nations is to work in partnership with the federal government on measures to implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, including co-development of a national action plan and discussion of proposals for federal legislative framework on implementation, to work closely on decolonizing and align federal laws and policies with the UN Declaration and First Nations inherent and treaty rights. And the final one is to dialogue on identifying priorities, basically socioeconomic gaps between First Nations and Canadians in terms of programs and services. Now that means AFN's involved in Canada's efforts to develop a Canadian definition of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Jim Carr, who was the Minister of Natural Resources of Canada, told the Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs in 2016 that the government's in the process of providing a Canadian definition to the Declaration, and that they're going to provide greater clarity to these definitions, and the government's going to get there by following a process and a regulatory regime. And Sharon Venne told the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues that same year in 2016 that Canada intends nothing less than to adopt and implement the Declaration. And again, they're saying in accordance with the Canadian Constitution, which means the federal and provincial governments and their interpretation of Section 35. So really, that's a qualification there. Canada believes that their constitutional obligations serve to fulfill all the principles of the UN Declaration, including free, prior, and informed consent. They see modern treaties and self-government agreements as the ultimate expression of free, prior, and informed consent among partners. Well, this is interesting because this seems to be the Canadian standard for saying that that's the indication that free, prior, and informed consent's been followed and that they're implementing the UN Declaration. But many First Nations across Canada have refused to negotiate under the self-government policy because it does lead to municipalization, and they refuse to negotiate under the comprehensive claims policy because it's based on extinguishing Aboriginal title. But yet they're saying that modern treaties and self-government agreements are going to be the standard they want to apply because they've got some groups to agree to that already. Jody Wilson-Raybould told that same meeting at the United Nations in 2016 that there's a need for a national action plan, something the government's been referring to as a reconciliation framework. She says they don't have to reinvent the wheel. Within Canada, there are modern treaties and examples of self-government, both comprehensive and sectoral. And what she means there by comprehensive could mean like a constitution, including a whole bunch of subject areas. Sectoral self-government agreement could be like taking over education and having an education self-government agreement. She also says there are regional, national, indigenous institutions that support nation rebuilding, for example, in land management and financial administration. While these aren't indigenous institutions she's referring to, they're federally created institutions with indigenous peoples on the boards. But the chairs of those boards are paid by the governor and council. They're not accountable to indigenous peoples, they're accountable to the federal government. So they're not indigenous institutions. And what they're referring to is the First Nations fiscal institutions based out here in Vancouver, the First Nations Finance Authority, the First Nations Management Board, First Nations Tax Commission. There was a First Nations Statistical Institute, but Harper killed that when he cut the money off. And they also have a First Nations Land Management, Land Advisory Board. And again, that was created by legislation, and although it has First Nations peoples on it, it's really a federally created body. But they're trying to sell it as indigenous institutions. And they're saying in land management and financial administration. Now you can't see this, but this is an internal chart of the federal government which shows a comparison of land regimes. The first column is the First Nations Private Ownership Initiative. And that's an initiative being promoted by Manny Jules, who heads up the First Nations Tax Commission, and Tom Flanagan. And under the Harper years, they were promoting this, and it's to privatize the residential lands on reserve. That's what they call the First Nations Private Ownership Initiative. And the other one is the First Nations Land Management Act, that's the second column. The third column is the Nisga'a Treaty. The fourth column is the Seashell Self-Government Agreement from 1985. And the fifth column is the Tawasin Treaty. And if you look on the sides, you can't see it again, but it does say that under lands that under the modern treaties there, Tawasin and Nisga'a, the lands are under the provincial land system now, not under 9124 lands like most other reserves. And also their Section 87 tax exemption is gone, they're paying taxes now. But this chart was to show that the First Nations Land Management Act is one of a number of directions that the federal government is going to get rid of reserves. Because the First Nations Land Management Act sets up land codes to identify individual interests, which then could become either part of the First Nations Private Ownership Initiative. By the way, the Liberals are still keeping that up, but they've renamed it the Indigenous Land Title Initiative to make it sound nicer, but still about privatizing residential lands on reserve. 2016 told the chiefs across Canada that adopting the UN Declaration into Canadian law is unworkable and a distraction, and that ultimately the UN Declaration will be articulated through the constitutional framework of Section 35, these self-government and land tenure agreements. Now there's preconditions to First Nations signing on to these modern agreements based on the comprehensive claims and self-government policies. First Nations need to agree to the extinguishment or modification of Aboriginal title. They need to agree to the legal release of Crown liability for past violations of Aboriginal title and rights. They need to agree to the elimination of Indian reserves by accepting lands as private property or fee simple. And they have to agree to remove their on-reserve tax exemption. They also have to agree to respect existing private lands and third-party interests, and therefore alienation of Aboriginal title territory without compensation. And they have to accept the existing federal and provincial laws applying to them, except the local laws that we could develop under the self-government laws. Program funding on a formula basis, own source revenue, that's what it's code for basically taxation. For the groups that have signed modern treaties already, like the Tawasin, the Nisga'a, the Yukon First Nations, the Dene, they've suspended the collecting. What the government does under their policy is, when you have own source revenue powers to collect taxes, they reduce the federal transfers. So they're agreeing to suspend reducing the federal transfer for 3 years because they're going to increase the funding formula to the groups that have signed modern treaties. And in order to get those who are at the negotiating tables to hurry up and sign final agreements, in yesterday's budget, they announced that they're forgiving, I think, $1.6 or $1.9 billion in loans that First Nations and the PCTC have borrowed and others. And they even say those who have paid back their loans will get paid back for paying their loans. So that's all carrots to induce people going more into signing these final agreements. And they have different techniques for extinguishing title. They have a certainty and finality clause, I think, which is in the Nisga'a Treaty. They have this modified and released clause where you modify Aboriginal title and release the Crown. And then they have a technique called non-assertion of rights where you agree in the self-government agreement or the modern treaty agreement not to assert your constitutional rights in exchange for the benefits that are laid out in the agreement. And for the cash and land portions of modern treaties, the approximate formula is 25,600 per person, 9.3 hectares or 23 acres per person. And that's based on the PC precedents, in Nisga'a and Tawasin and Lenault. So in exchange for that, you're extinguishing 95% of your Aboriginal title territory. So it's not a lot of money or land. So in 2017, without consulting AFN, even though they have agreements with them, Canada issued 10 principles on Indigenous relationships, which basically reinforce those preconditions I just went through. It's based on the doctrine of discovery, on respecting the existing constitutional framework, meaning you're going to be this fourth level of government. That's the base. These 10 principles are the basis of all federal policy and law development that they're doing now. So what I'm saying is that Trudeau's hijacking our right of self-determination, which is our most important right, recognized by the Declaration and by the other covenants of the United Nations. And the right of self-determination is an overarching umbrella right, and other articles spell it out in terms of land rights, governance, and free, prior, and informed consent. If you didn't have the right to self-determination, you wouldn't have the right to free, prior, and informed consent. And so for free, prior, and informed consent and Indigenous decision-making regarding access to lands and resources, it has to be recognized if the UN Declaration implementation is real. So obviously it's not real, because if you look across Canada with the Wet'suwet'en and Site C and the proposed pipelines, they're not using consent as the standard. Free, prior, informed consent. The Trudeau government is basically lying on that front. Now, his government since 2015 has been operating in secret through different processes. Initially, they set up a working group of ministers to review law and policies. Remember that big promise to decolonize Canada's laws? Jody Wilson-Raybould, as Justice Minister, was heading that working group up. But last year, something happened. They took that away from her, and they created a cabinet committee on reconciliation. And since it took over the work she was doing, and Jim Carr is the chair of that. Now he's the International Minister of Trade and Diversification, aka pipelines. And Carolyn Bennett and Jane Philpott, or Seamus O'Regan, and other ministers are on that reconciliation committee. But Jody Wilson was the last. Jody Wilson-Raybould was the last one listed in terms of precedence on that reconciliation committee. Of course, she's not on there anymore. The 10 principles respecting Indigenous, regarding Government of Canada's relationship with Indigenous peoples. Again, that was issued without consulting AFN, let alone Indigenous communities who are impacted by it. The dissolving and splitting the Department of Indian Affairs was announced without consultation. And again, that impacts Indigenous peoples on the ground. And the government's created this recognition of rights and self-determination tables across Canada. They kept those tables secret. Now they're listed, but what's not made public or transparent is what they're negotiating at those tables. And now Carolyn Bennett, assisted by her Senior Assistant Deputy Minister Joe Wild, is planning on announcing a new policy in June 2019. And most First Nations aren't aware of this, that this process is going on right now. Indian Act bans by the federal government are considered non-governing because they view the bans as being under the Indian Act, because their reserved lands, monies, and other resources and governance structure are managed by the provisions in the Indian Act. So they're considered to be non-self-governing groups. That's why they're in Department of Indigenous Services. In order to be in the Ministry of Crown Relations, you have to be a recognized Indigenous government. And under here you can see the only way you can be an Indigenous government is you have to sign a comprehensive land claim agreement, which includes a comprehensive self-government component, or a comprehensive agreement of self-government by itself without a land claim, or a legislative comprehensive self-government arrangement. And an example of that, I think, would be West Bay and Seashell. So those are the three ways. According to the Trudeau government, there's 3 paths to reconciliation. There's 75 recognition tables, or negotiating modern treaties or self-government agreements, or resolving specific claims, which is being done. They're trying to come up with a process through the Assembly First Nations. Now these exploratory tables, what they're calling recognition tables now, Joe Wild, who's in charge of them as the bureaucrat, says they could impact treaty negotiations, self-government powers, and resource management. I'm almost done. Anyways, as of December 2018, there's over 75 tables that represent over 390 Indigenous communities with a total population of over 850,000 people. To date, 28 preliminary type agreements have been signed as a result of these recognition tables or discussions. And over 118 million has been spent to support these discussions. So likely any Indigenous peoples around here are included in those numbers. Now, these are the recognition tables in BC. There's more across the country. I'll just flip through these, but there are a number of them. You might recognize some of them. And I put the source on there where I got this list from, in case people don't believe me. Here's where the modern treaties have been signed. The James Bay Agreement, north of 60. The Nishka in BC, Tsawwassen. They don't have Manoff on Vancouver Island listed here. They took this website down off the government site. I took screenshots of it, but there was a list of who were at the tables across the country on self-government and comprehensive claims. This is who's negotiating treaties in BC under the BC Treaty Commission process. So you can see it gets pretty crowded around here, over to Vancouver Island. And this just shows you that these negotiations are basically in all the provinces and territories across the country. And last February, Valentine's Day, Prime Minister Trudeau announced this framework to recognize and implement rights. At that time, Jody Wilson-Raybould was happy. That changed. They said they were going to delay the bill until after the next federal election, but now the minister is trying to come up with a new rights policy by June of this year. The bill they were going to pass that they're saying is delayed, but now probably will be contained in that new policy, is it's going to be a framework that's going to address all relations between First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, including pre-1975 treaties, because it's going to be a pan-Indigenous law. It was supposed to contain definitions of key terms like the inherent right to self-government, self-determination, Aboriginal title and rights, treaty rights, and the federal and provincial governments and jurisdiction would continue to dominate First Nations, and provincial governments would have a veto on anything that covered their area of jurisdiction. And they were going to set up an advisory committee to determine who would be eligible to be an Indigenous nation or collective. But they said that these governments would have the legal capacity of natural person, meaning a federal corporation, and that they would develop a list of powers the federal government would unilaterally, and they could amend that. So it's not, it wasn't joint development that they were talking about, or co-development. Now the minister, Sharon Venne, can sign non-legally binding agreements such as framework agreements and agreements in principle sooner without having to seek cabinet approval. So this is to accelerate rights termination agreements. They've signed 2 agreements in principle, one with the Northern Shuswap, Anishinaabe Aski Nation under that authority. The minister, Bennett, can now expedite negotiations to a final agreement stage by converting agreements in principle into final agreements. And there's no longer a requirement to negotiate an agreement in principle. And in addition, negotiating mandate extensions are no longer needed to go to cabinet. So that's to help Canada and negotiating partners to conclude agreements more quickly, maybe before the people find out. Anyways, they've started a process to replace the self-government and comprehensive claims policy. And, you know, basically it's what they've been looking at under this framework as a goal is to remove bans from the Indian Act and turn them into federally recognized Indigenous governments or nations that will have authority delegated to them by the Government of Canada. They'll be subject to the Canadian Constitution as a 4th order of government, below not only federal and provincial governments, but also with less power than municipal governments. And this is a chart showing the Kim Baird and federal lawyer named Tom Isaac to help them with this process to come up with this new policy by June. This is a federal chart, how they were created. And my conclusion is this is all self-determination. So what I say for the past 50 years is the main tenets or objectives of the white paper have been implemented through components rather than as a package. and through 5 decades rather than 5 years. And the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, is implementing not only his father's policies, but those of Jean Chrétien's, who was former Minister of Indian Affairs, Minister of Justice, and Prime Minister. And I'll leave off with a quote by Art Manuel, who said that self-determination is the antidote to colonialism. So Indigenous communities and nations need to develop their own self-determination plans to resist Canada's long-standing termination plan. Anyways, that's my presentation. Thank you.